Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, and on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I'm talking to Joshua Black, who is a postgraduate student in political history at the National Centre for Biography at the Australian National University in Canberra, and he's also an administrative officer for the Australian Historical Association. Lovely to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Georgina.
Josh, and today we're talking about your research really on political memoirs, which is a fantastic PhD thesis. I can imagine you have a lot of fun. And we're sitting here in your office at the ANU in the beautiful RSSS building, and I'm admiring the shelves upon shelves of memoirs you must have consumed over the last couple of years.
Yes, that's right. I've been lucky enough to buy a few of them at Lifeline book fairs and so on, which has been useful, kind of good for the budget as well.
Yeah, well, that's true. Well, the older ones you'd be able to get a hold of. But I guess the new... It's good to see you've got the young Menzies. I saw that on your bookshop too. That's very tactful, Josh. So this is a fascinating topic, and of course for the Robert Menzies Institute we think it's worthy of study. But political memoirs are a newish phenomenon, aren't they? Tell me about this phenomenon of political memoir.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways they are kind of one of the oldest forms of writing, certainly in the Western tradition, but in the Australian context it's a very recent kind of cultural product and commodity. Another historian did some research about 12 years ago, and what he found was that essentially, if you look at, say, 1 year in the late 90s or the early 2000s, you could see as many memoirs being written and published by Australian politicians as there were in the whole first half of the 20th century.
Wow.
I mean, the table, like a graph, is literally kind of exponential in its nature. So, yeah, this was a pretty sparse, patchy tradition. People did write memoirs before the late 20th century, but they were less popular, they were rarer, they were usually written a lot longer after the politician had retired. They were usually, before about the 1970s, written by Liberals and Conservatives, not by the Labor Party. That was a kind of later phenomenon. And they had less impact generally in the public sphere. I mean, they didn't become media phenomena or sensations in the way that they do today. They might be read by some, reviewed by others, but they didn't become scandals or spectacles in the way that they certainly did by the end of the 20th century.
So those early political memoirs, what was the purpose of them then if no one was really reading them and they weren't really noted in the media? Were they just a kind of a cathartic moment for the writer?
Yeah, so the few who did, George Reid is perhaps one obvious early example. I mean, they were often to invoke history with a capital H, right? I'm writing so that in 20 or 30 years from now, the scribes have a really rich, valuable source, that is me, to work from. So that's the lofty goal to which many of them work. And Menzies is in some ways the same tradition. His Afternoon Light begins with, I am not a historian, this is not a work of history, but historians might be interested in this later on. So it's that very explicit goal of furnishing the historical record with some stuff, some primary material. In other cases, it's also about sort of proving status as well. I mean, George Reid's memoir is kind of interesting in that he writes it in 1917, having been Australia's High Commissioner in London for some time. Much of the second half of the book is just him describing dinners with royalty in London and explaining who was there and what was on the menu and some of the, in truth, tedium of elite society in early 20th century London. The book was prohibitively priced, so it was, I think, the price of 1 guinea or 19 or 20 shillings, and it cost more than most people had spare in their pocket to go and buy a copy. So in some ways they were clearly objects of status as well.
Although I guess in that era you didn't own books like we own them today. You would tend to borrow them from a mechanics institute or the like. Yeah. So George Reid is writing for posterity, basically, to put it on the record rather than to make a large amount of money. And as you say, Robert Menzies is also not exactly the whole story. It's a series of essays on kind of setting the record straight in a lot of ways. This is maybe a matter of semantics, but in your view, what is the difference between writing your memoirs or writing an autobiography? Is it the autobiography you start on the day you were born up to the...
Yeah, it's a great question. It is a really good question, and people sort of still debate this. I mean, people get into very long arguments about typologies and how to categorise these things. In the marketplace, it's much of a piece. A reader won't generally walk into a shop and quibble with the shopkeeper because something is classified as a memoir when it should be autobiography. But I think the traditional definitions generally are that a memoir is more selective, it's a bit more thematic in its approach, it's generally as interested in other people and other characters as on the self. An autobiography traditionally would be more comprehensive. It would cover a whole person's life. It's usually something you wouldn't write until you're very well advanced in years and expect not to be around that much longer. And I guess in the Enlightenment tradition, it's sort of supposed to reproduce some essential nature of yourself, right? Something of you should be there on the page. In a memoir, you might be able to preface it by saying, this isn't all of me, this is just a couple of episodes from my working life. In an autobiography, you should be able to say, this is me, this is who I am, this is how I have become the person that I am in this moment, and this is the fullest representation of my character that I can illustrate using words. So that's kind of part of the distinction there. The diary is, of course, something else entirely. That's a series of daily or regular impressions and entries, and
they're not such bestsellers, I must say.
They're not usually bestsellers, although there's been one or two exceptions, which we can talk about later. Yeah. Mark Latham is perhaps relevant there.
Peter Reitz were interesting, I thought.
Were not unpopular in the 2010s either,
yeah. So you say there was very little written in the first 3/4 of the 20th century, but what was it about the last quarter of the 20th century in terms of our political culture or taste in literature that made political memoir become a thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of becoming a thing, the boom, if we want to call it that, it's partly a material story, a publishing industry story, and we sort of might be interested in coming back to that. But the political side of the equation is, I think, fascinating because it's largely about new kinds of conflict in Australian political culture. The end of the post-war boom, the end of the sort of classic 20th century style of Australian political economy, tariff protection, state paternalism, all the things that Paul Kelly would have called the Australian settlement. I mean, all of that is under challenge in the last quarter of the 20th century. And that's hard for policymakers and politicians. It's a bitter process. It's emotional. It causes all sorts of conflict inside the Liberal and Labor parties. This is also a period where the kind of terms and norms of political culture are changing, right? The personal is becoming political. That's the kind of the women's movement's mantra of the 1970s. And it has an effect on the political class as a whole. It has an effect on journalists. You can report on personal features of a politician's life by the year 2000 in a way that you simply could not have in 1960. So there's been a very long transition in what is considered in the public interest or what's worth public knowledge. You also have, I suppose, the rise of women in politics as candidates and MPs and eventually ministers as well. And that too brings with it new kinds of conflict. I think by the 21st century, you have examples of women who want to use the political memoir to show that women were there, were having a serious policy effect on the deliberations of the day. They want to show in some cases how the underlying masculine presumptions and culture of Canberra negatively affected women's experiences in Parliament. And I think in the more recent past, we've seen a number of books that kind of stake that claim to a unique kind of storytelling. Kate Ellis, Julia Banks, a few of these former women MPs have sort of written to say, actually, this system is set up for men and the lingering effects of that are still with us.
Do you think through the Menzies era, obviously, 16 years when he was Prime Minister the second time of uninterrupted leadership, perhaps there just weren't that many stories to be told? He dominated the political landscape in Australia, so if you were a Labor aspirant, Labor MP, you would never get to ministry during that Menzies era. You were constantly losing elections. Obviously, there was masses going on with the Labor split and the Cold War issues. But given you didn't reach a position in government, what was your story then?
I think that's right. I mean, the high rate of turnover at the upper echelons of Australian politics clearly has a role. I mean, the leadership churn of the last 15 years has clearly been a generator of memoirs and at a faster rate as well. I mean, once upon a time.
More people.
More people.
To sift through.
But they also worry that if they wait too long to tell their story, they'll get forgotten, which, I mean, somebody like Billy Hughes, for example, had no fear of being forgotten. He doesn't produce his memoirs, 2 volumes of them, until the late 1940s and early 50s. And
Case for Labor?
Well, that's before he becomes Prime Minister.
And Robert Menzies writes a foreword to the Case for Labor, which I always thought was, in the spirit of bipartisanship, that was quite a lovely thing. I mean, they would have had a complicated relationship.
They certainly would have.
Yeah. But what you were describing before, the changing nature of the Australian political environment and how that lent itself to the proliferation of political memoir in the last quarter of the 20th century. There's lots to unpack there. But when you were talking about that kind of unravelling of the Australian settlement as being a catalyst, it did strike me that there were some big things happening during the 50s, 60s and 70s. We've got the Cold War, for example, ideological battles that were played out not just internationally but domestically. Was that not something worthy of reflecting on?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly it's a good question. It's one of the things Menzies starts to do in, I think, the later volume of his memoirs, which is published in 1970, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But even there, I mean, it is surprising. You would expect people of the 50s and 60s to be putting pretty spirited stories in their memoirs. The style of Menzies' books are just not that, right? They are very non-posturing. They kind of aspire to be above politics in a way. He's had that 16-year period. He's happy to be a kind of elder statesman now. And I think others have made this point as well. He doesn't need to be a kind of partisan or philosophical warrior by the end of the 60s in the way that he once did, certainly in those Forgotten People broadcasts of the early 40s. Some on the Labor side do produce memoirs after that Menzies/Cold War period. Arthur Calwell is one. But again, it's just striking how little purchase these books get in the public sphere, right? They aren't kind of big headlines in the way that, say, a Hawke memoir by the 1990s is. Not just a newspaper headline, but dominating the nightly television news bulletin for days and days on end. These books are not that kind of spectacle in the 50s and 60s.
Is that because they're more cautious in what they write about? I mean, I know with Menzies' memoirs, he doesn't let rip on individuals when he could have. And so, you know, you're reading these thinking, oh, you're just going to tell us all about how you load spender or, you know.
And certainly there's very little of that.
Yeah.
In some ways, that's not unique to Menzies or to Liberals either, actually. I mean, it's fascinating listening to interview recordings with people like Frank Ford in the early 70s. These are men who have seen very vigorous conflict inside the Labor Party. And in an interview in the early 70s, he's sort of saying to the interviewer, I've known all of these remarkable characters and I have a very friendly feeling towards all of them and they're all remarkable men. And you sort of think, surely you don't actually think that. But the kind of the willingness to not carry on conflicts after leaving Parliament, the willingness to, I suppose, erring on the side of reticence is a trend that certainly unravels in the 70s. I think we can kind of pinpoint that decade as the period in which old values of discretion and decorum start to count for less in the public culture than they once did.
And the relationship that journalists have with the political class too is changing. I mean, you mentioned before that sense that the private realm becomes much more in the public interest over the decades through the 20th century. So a political leader of the early 20th century could pretty much get away with all manner of difficult personal situations. Although Harold Holt did wait in the 60s, he did wait for a little bit before marrying Zara, the woman who became his wife, and it was a second marriage for her. She'd been married before. So there was a sense that he needed to be a little bit careful about his personal circumstances. But mainly you could get away with quite a lot, whereas, I mean, we were just saying before, someone like Barnaby Joyce, who has marriage breakdown and a new relationship with one of his staff members, his media advisor, that was the downfall of his leadership, the National Party.
Yes.
And that was absolute fair game for the media to be delving into something that bore no relation to his leadership of the National Party. It was a completely separate set of circumstances, but it was a media frenzy.
Yes. Yeah, certainly this sort of changing idea of what is in the public interest and what the public needs to know is part of the story, I suppose, of why memoirs become a salient way of describing politics, explaining political change and explaining the political past. I suppose the one point worth making is that politicians themselves are complicit in the process, in that it's not uncommon for a senior politician to kind of display their family. Here is my wife, here is my children, this proves that I am of upright standing, and this will be reflected in my politics. That kind of performance, I suppose, also helps to unravel that public-private kind of distinction. And it is amazing when you put some of these later memoirs side by side with earlier examples at how self-revealing these men, generally men, are prepared to be. I mean, Malcolm Turnbull is perhaps a striking example of this in talking about some of the mental health challenges, his experiences of depression in the wake of losing the Liberal leadership. He talks about suicidal thoughts, and this is extremely personal, extremely intimate stuff. You kind of almost wouldn't imagine Menzies being willing to articulate this kind of emotion in a book like that. So I think, yes, journalists have played an important role in changing those terms of public and private, but so too have the politicians.
So Menzies' memoirs, so he writes to Afternoon Light and A Measure of the Years, and you've got them, two lovely copies. I hope they're first edition, sitting in front of you here, Josh. Tell me about these memoirs, because they're being criticised for being rather brief and not covering the field, but he did stress to his publisher that he was providing not the memoirs, but some memoirs. And I can see on the front it says, Some Memories of Men and Events, as the subtitle to Afternoon Light. But there you go.
That's right. I mean, this is absolutely not meant to be a definitive history. He sort of says, I can't be a historian. I can't be dispassionate or impartial. I can just give you some first-hand impressions. I can give you what I saw as best I can. And his publishers are largely happy with that. They're in London, he's sending manuscripts back and forth to them, and they're largely saying, yes, these are some impressions, these will be fine in the British market, they'll probably do well in the American market as well. They are criticised in Australia, partly because even in 1970 you can't pretend that Menzies didn't have party affiliations, you can't pretend that he wasn't part of a government that had an agenda to prosecute, which is invariably involves contention. But certainly in the American and British markets, he's received as a kind of lofty statesman figure in these books. In the second one, he does get a little more comprehensive in his treatment of his own government. I mean, there's a kind of series of chapters where he lists off the achievements of the Menzies years. He kind of says, the journalists carry on as if we did nothing for 16 years. Well, let me prove them wrong with examples A through Z. But by and large, they are dispassionate. They are distant. He tries to provide balance wherever he's talking about former rivals or opponents. And he's very careful to draw lines around the public and the private. You do see glimpses of his wife and his family. You do see glimpses of other politicians' wives and families, but very sparingly and with very particular effect. One of the more striking features of these books, and it's all the more striking when you put them next to later Liberal leaders and their writings, is just how ideologically imprecise they are. They aren't saying, here is liberalism, here is what liberalism means, this is what the Liberal Party of Australia should be about. He does have a chapter in Afternoon Light that is about the making of the Liberal Party in the mid-1940s, and it's very administrative. It's, here are 14 organisations, here is me, your founding father, bringing them together. And he acknowledges leading contributions of a few other characters, but it's very largely about me, the founding father, putting together this new force. There's even a part in Afternoon Light where he basically says the Liberal Party and the Country Party are very similar. We usually just get together and put together a similar program. He's not particularly bothered about ideological differences there either, which is fascinating from our contemporary perspective, where you do expect to see some ideological difference within the broad coalition family. And that is, one of the striking differences between those writings and Liberal reminiscences now. You do expect somebody like John Howard to turn around and say, the Liberal Party is a broad church. Here is my economic liberalism and social conservatism. Somebody like Malcolm Fraser will write a book that says, I know what true liberalism is. Here it is. It's me. That's kind of what they're doing with these memoirs in a way that Menzies just wouldn't have thought was necessary.
Although in 1942 to 44, when he's delivering the radio broadcasts on Friday nights at 9:15 p.m, 105 of them, he does articulate what liberalism means to him.
Yeah.
And it's in very easily consumable terms. He doesn't speak to grand theories of ideological or philosophical theories, but he does articulate a platform, doesn't he? Whereas, as you say, in Afternoon Light and A Measure of the Years, I read them and thought it was a lot of setting the record straight, say on the Suez Crisis. This is my interpretation of how it unfolded, and these are the reasons why I took these actions to deal with whatever events were, before me. And it's sort of a justification. And I found it interesting too that he didn't ever concede mistakes.
No, not particularly. He does concede that he became at times unpopular, or that he didn't necessarily have the finesse that he later acquired at managing other men in particular, but he doesn't concede much in the way of policy mistakes. I suppose that difference between the Forgotten People broadcasts and the later memoirs is in the 1940s, he's actually trying to carve out a space for a non-Labor party, a new non-Labor force in politics. By 1967, when Afternoon Light is kind of on its way to the shelves, the Liberal Party looks extremely comfortable. Not only has it won an election victory, even without Menzies in 1966 by a massive margin, it looks set to continue being the natural party of government, a party that will continue to benefit from very positive prevailing local and world economic circumstances. I mean, there's no reason to suspect a Labor revival in the near future at the time that he's writing, certainly Afternoon Light. It is interesting that one of the things his publishers ask for in the second book is, why don't you go and criticise socialism a little bit more? And in particular, they're interested in Harold Wilson's government in the UK. They kind of say to Menzies, go and criticise Wilson, tell us about the dangers of socialism in Britain. And I think he's sort of somewhat resistant to it, although he indulges a little in some of the British media appearances he does to promote the book. But by and large, he doesn't need to do that kind of ideological posturing and explaining, whereas by the 21st century, those philosophical debates within and around the Liberal Party are so acute that somebody like Fraser and someone like Howard are very keen to use their memoirs to do that kind of work, to try and affix to liberalism a particular meaning.
So in the 40s and 50s, you had an intense competition between the alternate points of view of democracy versus communism or fascism. And then in the Cold War, absolutely democracy, communism. But by the 1970s, we weren't seeing those battles so clearly in the political debates. Is that what happened? So it's sort of, by the time Menzies is writing these, it's sort of fizzled away?
I think so. I mean, certainly notwithstanding the Vietnam War, I mean, the kind of intense sharpness of the Cold War is not the same in 1967 as it had been even, 6 or 7 years earlier. I'm thinking of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. But I suppose what happens in the 70s and more markedly in the 1980s is that policymakers in Australia are trying to deal with domestic change. I mean, they're less preoccupied, many of them, with the bipolar world of the Cold War. They're trying to figure out how to make Australian capitalism work in an era of enormous disruption and shock. The oil price shock of 73 and again in 79, debates about tariff reform, debates about making Australian industry more competitive and more efficient. This is high-level stuff. It sort of strikes at nerves that predate the Cold War. It strikes at the nerves of the Deaconite tradition, which is why, as well as causing much pain in the Labor Party, it causes much pain in the Liberal Party too. And those are some of the debates that I think more directly precipitate the sort of combative, interventionist, policy-explicit memoir of the modern period.
So does it morph in the 70s and 80s into more manifesto over memoir? Is that what we're seeing? So you're a Liberal Party MP or a minister or a shadow minister and you take a certain view on capitalism and how the economy should work and you're setting that out as an ideological view. Say you're one of the dries of the 80s.
Yes, yeah.
As opposed to the wets in your own party. So those battle lines are ferociously fought out and you're setting this out in writing. Is that what drives it?
Yeah, partly. I mean, it's more explicit in the Labor Party. The Labor right are very proud of their economic reforms of the 80s and the Labor left are distraught. Somebody like Tom Uren releases a memoir in the mid-90s and his chapter on the Hawke government begins with, the first two Hawke governments were bloody awful, lacking real compassion for the people they should have been representing. I mean, there's nothing ambiguous about that, is there? That's an explicit statement of policy right and wrong from his perspective. And I think as you get to the 21st century, a similar story happens with the Liberals. I mean, certainly you get capital M manifestos from people like Tony Abbott who want to say in 2009, this is what conservatism means to me. This is why I think it has a home, a happy home in the Liberal Party of the modern age. Others say that they're writing a manifesto and don't. They kind of offer some fairly superficial slogans or we believe in growth or we believe in equality. Everyone in theory does. So what specifically are you saying? Many of these manifestos, as we call them, they do become in the 21st century fairly shallow pieces of propaganda. Many of them are sponsored by one publishing house, at the time Melbourne University Press, led by the really fascinating and formidable Louise Adler, who is a really dynamic figure in the story of modern memoir publishing in Australia. But some of those manifestos very clearly an attempt on the part of a politician and their staff, who play a big role in writing those books, to say, here is my brand, let me do some brand control or some brand management. Here is a book. We can go on a book. You'll be on the news promoting this book several times a week for the next few months. This book can be another part of your platform. In few cases does it lead to the kind of leadership ambition that many of these authors hope it will. Tony Abbott is, I think, the exception, actually.
Right. But the publishers see potential in these books.
Yeah.
So tell me about that. They're obviously seeing a few are published, they see some good sales figures and they think, well, this is a growing market. I might pursue more and more of these.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two tensions that connect to make this particular kind of literature so commercial. One is that in the second half of the 20th century, you get a local publishing industry, which is something that basically not existed or only intermittently existed before then. People talked about a kind of an imperial market or an imperial dumping ground for British books. By the 60s and 70s, you do have local presses trying their hand and they're willing to make a loss to sell an Australian story, even an Australian political story.
And Josh, before you go on, why did we not have a domestic publishing market in the early 20th century? Was it just small population, less educated population, books were too expensive for most people to buy? I mean, what were the factors around that?
It's partly a more elemental story of imperial control, actually. I think that sort of agreements between Australian firms and British publishers and printers were such that British suppliers genuinely did have just a kind of monopoly over the Australian market. It was small, so the startup costs for a local firm were prohibitively expensive. It's not as if there was no local publishing, but it was just the case that Britain dominated the market in terms of its trade agreements and in terms of its ownership of content and intellectual property and so on. So often if you wanted to tell an Australian story, you needed to be able to convince someone in London that it was worth telling.
Dare I ask, was Castle an Australian publisher?
No. So Menzies sort of written and published with a London-based publisher, and they're produced for not necessarily an Australian market first. I mean, you can sort of see in parts of this book the way in which certain terms are used to capture American audiences and British audiences especially. And all of this is changing at the end of the 20th century. You do have local publishers, you have some very experimental publishers who are prepared, as I say, to take risks on local politicians and their stories. But you also have more sophisticated market monitoring practices in the publishing sector by the end of the 20th century. 2001, you get Nielsen BookScan, which allows publishers to track exactly what the sales figures are doing week on week, and they can kind of see which books are safe bets and which ones are too risky to be commercially viable. And in some ways that fuels the rise of what we'd call celebrity publishing, right? Politicians are sort of celebrities, some of them major, some minor, and they come with what's assumed to be an existing market, an existing audience. You can be guaranteed that if ex-Labor politician publishes a book, at least that section of the Labor Party will buy it. Whether they read it is another question, but they will buy it. Similarly, if Tony Abbott produces battle lines, MUP they can make a safe bet that at least a good chunk of the Liberal Party will buy that. So the assumption is that celebrity publishing comes with an existing market, an existing audience, and it's a safer bet than experimental fiction. Who's going to sort of pick a really risky postmodern experimental novel to invest in over something like this that will have invariably
You're holding
several
up
thousand.
Joe Hockey's Diplomatic.
That's right.
There. Covered in post-it notes, so
right.
I think it was well read.
It was well read. But I mean, something like that is going to have inevitably a few thousand readers. And in the Australian market, that's a happy sale.
So someone like Louise Adler, who is long-term editor of Melbourne University Publishing, so she's taking a view that this is a winning formula, the political memoir, and will give these members of parliament, these ministers, the opportunity to put out their thoughts, and we'll get a reliable few thousand sales, or hopefully. You say, I think Lazarus Rising, John Howard's memoir, got 100,000.
100,000, yeah.
Quite a lot.
Well, I mean, it is interesting. Melbourne University Press started really well in this field. Louise Adler had already been a really strong publisher in this field. She'd published Bob Hawke's memoirs in the 90s, and under her leadership, MUP produced Mark Latham's very controversial and colourful diaries in 2005. And that was, I think, its big success story. Somewhere like 50 or 55,000 copies of those diaries get sold, which is unheard of for a political diary in the Australian market, certainly. And, in talking with Louise, it was clear that this focus on political memoir publishing developed organically in the wake of that astonishing success. Peter Costello's book, a whole series of manifestos, people like not just Tony Abbott, but Andrew Robb, Chris Bowen, Chris Pine. A number of these people kind of are attracted to MUP, and Adler is attracted to them because she's proven what the political publishing industry can do. Over time, it becomes a less successful formula. I mean, by the time we get to someone like Bill Shorten, and he sort of produces a pre-election, essentially a pamphlet in 2016. It's called For the Common Good. It sells about 800 copies, less than 1,000. And that's not a particularly successful number for MUP to be achieving when it's invested sometimes significant amounts of time and labour and capital into producing these kinds of books.
It's interesting you comment that initially political memoirs were written by the Liberal side of politics, but then we see a shift to the Labor side of politics writing them. And I know, John Hirst has said that Liberals were partly to blame for the dearth of historical research on their own movement, unlike Labor. Liberal figures are not interested in their history and write fewer memoirs. Well, that was obviously an observation of the latter part of the 20th century.
I think 2003 he said that.
Yeah,
it's an interesting comment. I mean, what is it that made people less interested? I mean, is he right? Is one question worth asking? Perhaps not. I thought it was an interesting point that John Hirst was making there, because at the time he's writing that, Labor figures were producing a memoir every 6 months about the Hawke-Keating years and debating the success or otherwise of what they had done, whether their transformation of the Australian economy had been correct or worth it, and what the human toll had been along the way. He's sort of saying, well, Liberals don't do this. They don't write these tell-all revealing memoirs.
Maybe it's because they weren't in government.
Well, they certainly weren't for that long period of time.
For much of the 80s and 90s,
no,
they weren't. So
they had, of course, had the 7 years under Fraser, and I think he's pointing there to people like Fraser, who at that time hadn't written anything and might have expected to have been writing. But, of course, it does change. By the time you get to 2010, Liberals are kind of back in the genre. They're producing memoirs, and again, it's partly a product of the big debates that emerge in the wake of the Howard years. Which direction are we moving in as a party? Where do we go from here? Not unlike the present moment, the Liberal Party was out of office everywhere, federally and at the state level, at the end of 2007. And so for Liberals across the country, it's a moment of reckoning. Where are we going? What are we doing? Which traditions do we preserve and which ones do we abandon?
So Josh, you're saying watch this space. We're about to be inundated with a swathe of Liberal memoirs as we see the Liberal Party out of government on the mainland, isn't it? Except for Tasmania.
We may not see the same kind of wave that we saw in the wake of the Howard years, but I think parts of some members of that government have already clearly done some of that work. I mean, we've got memoirs from Malcolm Turnbull, from Christopher Pyne. We've got Joe Hockey here now. Perhaps at some stage, people like Julie Bishop will pen their thoughts. And so I think from some parts of the party, you will see additional memoir output. It's partly a function of reckoning, a function of taking stock of what has happened over a sustained period in government and then a significant electoral loss.
Josh, how important is it for the historical record to look at these memoirs? So you're a historian, you're in the archives, in the National Library, looking at the primary sources, but you then have these memoirs. If they're not written, that then leaves a kind of a vacuum to be filled by historians with their own interpretations. Is it not to the benefit of these figures that they put something on the record?
It can be. It helps us to understand the emotional logics rather than the raw policy logic of particular decisions. It's really useful for us to know how certain people felt at a particular moment, and in some ways diaries are better for this. They're still edited, they're still adjusted, but you do get a slightly more raw sense of how someone was affected by a policy decision or what their feelings were during a party room spill or a cabinet debate or whatever the case may be. They can introduce problems into the historical record as well. I mean, certain memoirs don't always clarify the kinds of things that they're saying. So, I mean, Menzies in some ways actually a really good example, that part of Memoir Afternoon Light where he's talking about liberalism and he says, we were determined to be a progressive, forward-looking party, not reactive, but better than the socialists, essentially is what he's saying. It introduces a problem actually because subsequent Liberals like to go back to that line. They like to quote it and say, well, clearly this proves that he meant X. And others will say, well, actually, it clearly proves that he meant why. So it's useful to have, but it doesn't necessarily solve problems or create understanding. The debates between them can also introduce other problems as well. One example that comes to mind here is Bob Hawke's memoir. He very famously at the time accused Paul Keating, one, of calling Australia the arse end of the world, which was pretty unpopular inside the Labor Party, and two, of opposing Australia's involvement in the First Gulf War. His claim is Paul Keating sat there in the meeting and said, "What has the US ever done for us? Why should we be sending troops to the Gulf in 1991? Well, it's not clear that that's actually what happened. Keating disputed it. Other ministers who were present disputed it. Hawke refused to give any ground on that and said, no, I'm absolutely telling the truth. Keating didn't want to go to the Gulf. And so subsequent historians are then left with a problem that ultimately the memoir has introduced or accentuated into the historical record, and which then has to be solved with reference to the original archive. So they are really interesting dynamic sources to have, but we always have to be conscious of the ways in which they're produced, the impact of publishers and ghostwriters and editors, and also conscious that they sometimes introduce new problems into the historical record, even as they might help to illuminate other things.
One thing I've noted through our discussion is the lack of women writing memoirs. And of course, that's partly because there haven't been very many women up until recently holding positions of leadership in Australian politics. I mean, bar Julia Gillard, we haven't had another Australian Prime Minister who's been a woman. There have been, in recent decades, women in key ministerial positions, but really in the 20th century, they were an aberration. They were unusual. Tell me about how gender and the place of women in memoir writing has evolved as you've seen it in your research.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question and a really huge one. I mean, the genre is part of a larger political tradition which kind of assumes that men are the normal actors of Australian politics, right? You know, if you're a politician, you are a man. If you're a citizen, you're kind of a woman. That's almost the kind of cultural dichotomy, right? Men are the policy actors, women are the nation. And at the end of the 20th century, obviously that changes because up to a quarter or a third of the parliament are women by the time the turn of the century rolls around. You have had some senior women ministers. By 2010, obviously you have a woman prime minister. The memoirs are tricky in that they are sometimes used to advocate for more progressive change in Australia's gendered political culture. Somebody like Julia Gillard obviously has a chapter that's devoted entirely in her memoir to the question of gender. And she ends with a relatively happy note, which is to say things will get better. The first was always going to be hard. The next will have an example of what to do and what not to do. I'm very optimistic about the future. But actually, at times, memoirs have been kind of at the forefront of the gendered contest or conflict in Australia's public culture. Cheryl Kernot, the former leader of the Australian Democrats and then Labor MP, famously published a memoir in 2002, which had to be sort of not withdrawn, but whose book tour was cancelled, right? She was sort of partway through a book tour when the journalist Laurie Oakes revealed that she'd not told the full story about some of her relationships with colleagues, or one colleague in particular.
Gareth
Evans, yes. And the book tour was halted. She was chased by journalists. She kind of went to bunker for a couple of weeks before resurfacing. And there is a gendered way of understanding this, I think. It's in some ways a male-dominated political class telling, in this case, a woman, no, you can't speak out on this particular occasion. Her book was pretty controversial in that it said a lot about the Labor Party and its male-dominated structures and processes. It had a lot to say about Kim Beazley. It had a lot to say about the media and parts of the Murdoch press in particularly. That gave people clear incentive to shut that book tour down, to kind of delegitimise the story, to say that this feminist memoir can't be trusted because the author didn't tell you the full story. So memoirs have been a really complex part of these gendered debates and discourses for some time now, actually. And in the more recent past, you've had women from across the political spectrum using memoirs to make a case for women's empowerment in the public sphere far more assertively and in a different style. Kate Ellis's book a couple of years ago, Sex, Lies and Question Time it's called, is in some ways a kind of collective memoir. She's gone and interviewed women from all of the major parties, everybody from Sarah Hanson-Young to Pauline Hanson. And she's sort of tried to tell their stories as a group. She's tried to evoke a shared experience of what it's like to be a woman in the often toxic environment of Parliament House. And these kinds of stories are packaged in increasingly bright and colourful covers, and that in itself is something. It's no longer a genre dominated by lofty statesmen and very staid, stately kinds of styles. It's sort of bright, it's colourful, it's designed to capture attention, to prosecute a very specific message about women in politics.
In 1972, Dame Enid Lyons, so the wife of Prime Minister Joe Lyons, but obviously the first woman elected to the House of Representatives, so a significant political figure in her own right, she wrote her memoir, or published her memoir, Among the Carrion Crows. How was that viewed at the time? Because that would have been quite a unique offering in the political memoir genre from a woman, and period, well, Gough Whitlam winning the election the end of that year, so a period of huge political change was incoming.
Yes,
so it would have been quite a fascinating reception, no doubt.
Yeah, it was interesting. How it received depended on who you asked and what their particular view of, I suppose, gender was. So lots of women's groups at the time were really positive about this memoir. They thought that it's useful to have a maternal example of women in politics there on hand. There were some women's liberation groups who were pointing to Lyons' book and reviewing it and saying this is an example of what an empowered woman in politics can look like, and rightly so. Other journalists, often male journalists, were more interested in what she had to say about Robert Menzies and Jo Lyons, her husband, and their relationship. Some of the common reviews said, Lyons reveals new tidbits on the Menzies-Lyons relationship kind of thing. So her aspect of the story was ignored in favour of what she could reveal about her husband, Joe. And in some ways, she's an extremely unique figure to be occupying those two distinct roles, a former prime ministerial spouse and also a senior cabinet minister in her own right. And it is interesting, as I say, depending on who you asked, you got very different interests, to put it in a more effective way. People were interested either in her role as a spouse or in her role as a minister, but very rarely both.
Right, yes. Well, I note one of the comments about her book was it was an important book marked by charm as well as frankness. It did irritate me somewhat that, of course, if you're a woman, you can't just be a significant figure in certain events. It's about your character,
yes,
and you have to be charming and pretty. Anyway, I digress. I wanted to finish our discussion today, Josh, by asking you what your favourite political memoir is.
It's a good question. It's a very hard question to answer. I mean,
How many have you read?
Lots.
Hundreds.
Probably in the order, I mean, not the ones here, probably in the order of 45 or 50 at least, potentially more. I have a few favourites along the way. I think Neil Blewett, who was a Labor minister in the 1980s and 90s, did a really incredible cabinet diary, and it's just an almost unbeatable sketch of what it was like to be in Paul Keating's first government. A really incisive observer, really expert on policy detail, but also alert to the kind of small social cues that happen in a cabinet room. I think his is one of the best. I think Enid Lyons is a remarkable memoirist in many ways. I mean, she describes the experience of making grown men cry with her maiden speech in the House in 1943. She describes what it was like to be the first woman to navigate the physical environment, sitting on these benches that are designed for men and men's frames and so on. It's a really interesting story that she tells. Perhaps the most impactful, and this is not necessarily to say that it's a pleasurable read, but one of the most significant perhaps has been Graham Richardson's book, Whatever It Takes. It's published in the mid-90s, and uniquely among this genre, the title sticks. It sticks to him, it sticks to the right wing of the New South Wales Labor Party, but it also sticks to, I suppose, Australia's political class in general in some ways. The very hardened, cynical attitude that voters develop in the 21st century towards politicians, I think, is perhaps exacerbated by a book like that. We will do whatever it takes to win because winning is what matters. It struck me as I was doing some of this research that as I was writing my chapter on Bob Hawke and Graham Richardson and their memoirs, the New South Wales Labor Party was rocked in 2019 by that scandal about donations in Aldi bags and so on, Kayla Murnane and the operatives of New South Wales Labor. And it struck me that the journalists instantly reached for that phrase, whatever it takes, to explain the culture that these kinds of events occurred in. That to me suggested that that book had a very long run effect on the way people imagine and understand politics in Australia. It is a colourful read, but I do think in some ways it's been particularly impactful at the kind of popular vernacular level.
Well, thank you so much, Josh, for this discussion today. Absolutely fascinating for all the political history junkies out there, and look forward to seeing where your writing goes next, and no doubt you'll be filling bookshelves with interesting tomes over the years. So thank you so much, Josh, for joining me on Afternoon Light.
Thanks, Georgie.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.